Everyone laughed when Grace Miller walked into Street Vincent's emergency room, wearing shoes with cracked soles. They laughed harder when the rain followed her inside. Water dripped from her second-hand coat, from the ends of her messy brown hair, from the cheap canvas bag pressed against her chest like it held the last pieces of her life together. The nurses at the front desk looked up, then looked at each other. "Grace," one of them said, smiling without kindness. "Did the shelter lose power again?" A few patients turned. Grace lowered her eyes. She was used to it, used to the whispers, used to the way people stared at her faded scrubs, her tired face, her hands rough from working double shifts and still not making rent. Used to doctors forgetting her name until they needed someone to clean blood off the floor. But tonight felt different. Tonight the air outside was too quiet. The hospital parking lot sat under heavy rain, neon lights bleeding red and blue across the asphalt. Grace had just reached for the sign-in clipboard when Dr. Carter stepped out from behind the desk, his white coat perfect, his voice sharp enough to cut. "You're late." Grace swallowed. "The bus broke down." That excuse again? A security guard chuckled. Someone near the vending machine whispered, "Poor little nurse can't even afford a car." Grace's fingers tightened around the clipboard. She wanted to disappear. Then the ER doors opened behind her. Not slid. Opened. Slowly. Every conversation in the room weakened, like someone had turned down the volume of the world. A man stepped inside wearing a black coat soaked with rain. Tall, broad-shouldered, silent. His dark hair was wet, his face pale beneath a brutal kind of calm. Blood stained one side of his shirt. Grace saw the wound before anyone else did. Gunshot. Deep. Fresh. The security guard reached for his radio. "Sir, you need to—" The man lifted his eyes. The guard stopped talking. Grace forgot how to breathe. There was something terrifying in his stare. Not panic, not pain, control. As if even bleeding, even half dead, he still owned the room. Dr. Carter stepped forward annoyed. "This is a hospital, not a crime scene. Who are you?" The stranger's gaze moved past him, straight to Grace. For one impossible second, the entire ER vanished. The laughter, the rain, the humiliation, all of it disappeared beneath the weight of that stare. Then he collapsed. Grace moved before anyone else did. She caught him by the shoulders as his body dropped, the impact nearly taking her down with him. Blood soaked through her sleeves, hot against her skin. "Get a gurney," she shouted. No one moved. Dr. Carter stared at the blood. "Grace, step away." "He's bleeding out." "I said step away." Grace looked at the stranger's face. His lashes were lowered, his breathing uneven, but his hand suddenly closed around her wrist with terrifying strength. His eyes opened halfway. "Not him," he rasped. Grace froze. His gaze burned into hers. "You?" The room went silent. Dr. Carter's expression hardened. "He's delirious." Grace pressed her hand over the wound. "Pressure. Now. You don't give orders here." "No," she said, voice shaking but firm. "But if we wait another minute, he dies." For the first time that night, no one laughed. Then the sound came. Low at first. Engines. One after another. Deep, expensive, powerful engines rolling into the parking lot like thunder. Everyone turned toward the glass doors. Grace looked too. Black SUVs filled the hospital entrance. Not one. Not two. A whole convoy. Headlights cut through the rain. Doors opened in perfect sequence. Men in black suits stepped out, all armed, all moving with controlled violence. The parking lot that had mocked her poverty moments ago now looked like a war zone. The security guard whispered, "Oh my God." Dr. Carter went pale. One man entered first, silver-haired, ruthless-eyed, carrying no umbrella. Rain ran down his face as he looked at the stranger bleeding in Grace's arms. Then he looked at Grace. His voice was quiet, deadly. "Who touched him?" No one answered. The stranger's bloody hand tightened around Grace's wrist again. Barely conscious, he turned his face toward her. And in front of everyone who had mocked her, he whispered, "Protect the nurse." Grace felt every pair of eyes in the emergency room land on her at once. Not on Dr. Carter. Not on the armed men flooding the hospital entrance. Here. The poor nurse they mocked 15 minutes ago. Rain hammered the glass behind the convoy of black SUVs while the unconscious stranger bled across her hands. His grip around her wrist had weakened, but even half-conscious, he refused to let go completely. The silver-haired man stepped forward. Danger moved with him. Not loud danger, worse, controlled danger. The kind that didn't need to threaten people to terrify them. Sir, Dr. Carter said carefully, trying to recover his authority, we need everyone to remain calm. The older man ignored him completely. His cold eyes stayed fixed on Grace. You're treating him? Grace swallowed. He needs surgery now. One of the armed men scanned the room like he was memorizing faces for funerals later. Another locked the hospital entrance. Click. The sound echoed through the ER. Patient stopped breathing. The silver-haired man finally spoke again. Save him, he said softly, and none of you leave. Fear spread through the room like poison. Grace forced herself to focus on the wound instead of the guns surrounding her. Help me move him, she ordered. This time, people obeyed instantly. The gurney arrived. Grace climbed beside the stranger as they rushed him toward trauma surgery. Blood covered her fingers, her sleeves, even the front of her neck where it had splashed when he collapsed. The silver-haired man walked beside the bed the entire way. What's his name? Grace asked. Silence. She glanced up. The older man studied her carefully, almost suspiciously. You don't know who he is? No. For the first time, the man looked genuinely surprised. Before he could answer, the stranger's hand suddenly grabbed Grace's sleeve again. His eyes opened slightly. Dark. Sharp. Even dying, they held power. Stay, he muttered. Then he passed out again. The older man exhaled slowly. Interesting. Inside the operating room, chaos exploded. Doctors rushed for instruments. Nurses connected monitors. The heart rate alarm screamed through the room while rain rattled the windows outside. Grace cut open the stranger's blood-soaked shirt. Several people froze. Scars. His body was covered in them. Knife wounds. Bullet wounds. Old violence carved permanently into skin stretched over muscle. This wasn't an ordinary man. Grace pushed the thought away. BP dropping. Internal bleeding. We're losing him. Dr. Carter stepped beside her. Move aside. I'll take over. Grace looked at the monitor. Then at the wound. Something felt wrong. The bullet trajectory. The blood flow. The breathing. Wait, she said suddenly. Dr. Carter snapped. What now? The bullet didn't stay center mass. What? It shifted lower after impact, he scoffed. You think you know better than a surgeon? Grace ignored him. She pressed carefully near the wound. The unconscious man's body reacted instantly, not weakly, violently. His hand shot up and grabbed her wrist hard enough to hurt. The entire room froze. Even unconscious, his instincts were lethal. Grace stared at him in shock. His breathing turned ragged. Pas réponse. Her eyes widened. The bullet's near the liver, she whispered. Not the heart. Dr. Carter hesitated. That hesitation saved the man's life. 40 minutes later, the bullet came out, and the patient survived. The operating room released its breath all at once. Grace stepped back against the wall, exhausted. Her hands trembled from adrenaline. Dr. Carter removed his gloves slowly, frustration written across his face because he knew it too. She had been right. One of the younger nurses looked at Grace differently now. Not with pity, with disbelief. The silver-haired man entered the recovery room minutes later. Armed guards remained outside the door like statues. How is he? He asked. Stable, Grace answered quietly. The man nodded once. Then his eyes lowered to the blood on her scrubs. You saved his life. Grace looked through the glass at the unconscious stranger, lying beneath dim recovery lights. Anybody would have done it. The older man almost smiled. No, he said. They wouldn't. A heavy silence settled between them. Then, who is he? The man studied her for several seconds before answering. You truly don't know. That's what I said. Outside, thunder shook the hospital. The older man stepped closer, lowering his voice. The man you saved tonight, he said, is Luca Moretti. Grace waited. Nothing. The man's expression changed slightly. Then, realization hit him. You're serious. I don't follow Mafia news. A nearby nurse suddenly gasped quietly. Another crossed herself. Dr. Carter went completely pale. Grace looked around the room in confusion. What? The silver-haired man stared at her carefully. In this city, he said softly, men disappear for saying his name too loudly. The temperature in Grace's body dropped. She turned slowly toward the recovery room window, toward the dangerous stranger lying unconscious beneath hospital lights. Luca Moretti. Even asleep, he looked terrifying, like violence wearing a beautiful face. Rain continued pouring outside while black SUVs guarded every hospital exit. and for reasons Grace couldn't explain. She couldn't stop thinking about the moment he looked at her, like she was the only person in the room. Then the monitor beside Luca's bed suddenly beeped faster. Grace frowned. His heart rate was rising. She stepped closer to the glass. Luca's eyes were still closed, but his lips moved slightly, and through the quiet hum of hospital machines, Grace heard him whisper her name for the very first time. Grace. Grace stopped breathing. The sound barely escaped Luca's lips, rough and broken beneath the oxygen mask, but she heard it clearly. So did everyone else in the room. The silver-haired man's eyes narrowed instantly. Dr. Carter looked between Grace and the unconscious Mafia boss, like he was witnessing the beginning of a disaster. "How does he know your name?" one nurse whispered. Grace shook her head slowly. I don't know." But even she heard how weak that answer sounded. Luca Moretti wasn't supposed to notice people like her. Men like him didn't remember poor nurses with second-hand shoes and overdue rent notices stuffed inside their lockers. Yet somehow, bleeding and unconscious, he had remembered her name. The monitor continued beeping steadily. Grace forced herself to move again. Professional, calm, detached. That was the only way to survive this night. "He's waking up," she said quietly. The silver-haired man immediately turned toward the guards outside the recovery room. "Clear the hallway." Within seconds, armed men flooded the corridor. Patients were relocated. Visitors disappeared. Even hospital staff moved faster when those men looked at them. Fear had taken over the building completely. Grace adjusted Luca's fourth carefully while trying not to look directly at him. It didn't help. Even unconscious, his presence filled the room. His dark hair fell across his forehead, slightly damp from the rain. His chest rose slowly beneath fresh bandages. The sharp angles of his face looked carved from stone beneath the low hospital lighting. Dangerous. Beautiful. Terrifying. Grace hated herself for noticing all three. "Miss Miller." She looked up. The silver-haired man stood near the door, watching her closely. "I'm Vincent." She nodded once. "You should go home after this," he said. Something about his tone made her uneasy. "Why?" Vincent hesitated. Then, "Because once Luca wakes up, things may become complicated." Before Grace could ask what that meant, the recovery room door burst open. Trevor Hale stormed inside. Grace's stomach dropped instantly. Of course. The universe wasn't finished humiliating her tonight. Trevor wore an expensive leather jacket and the same arrogant expression he'd carried through most of their 2-year relationship before she finally left him. Tall, handsome in a cruel way, permanently angry whenever life stopped revolving around him. He smelled like alcohol and bad decisions. "There you are," he snapped. Grace immediately stepped away from Luca's bedside. "Trevor, not now." Trevor glanced around the guarded room. "What the hell is this?" No one answered. He looked at the armed men outside, then laughed nervously. "What, you dating drug dealers now?" Vincent's expression didn't change. Trevor didn't notice. He was too focused on Grace. "You ignored my calls. I was working. You think you're too good for me now?" "Trevor." "No." He stepped closer. "You disappear for 2 weeks, then suddenly you're hiding in some VIP hospital room?" Grace could already feel eyes turning toward them through the glass walls. Humiliation crawled up her throat again. "Please lower your voice." Trevor scoffed loudly. "Why? So your rich boyfriend can sleep?" The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Vincent slowly lifted his eyes toward Trevor. That should have been enough warning. It wasn't. Trevor pointed at Luca, unconscious in the bed. "Who even is this guy?" Silence. Grace saw several guards exchange looks. One of them actually reached toward his jacket. Her pulse spiked. "Trevor," she whispered urgently. "Stop talking." But Trevor had always confused recklessness with strength. He stepped even closer to Grace. "You left me for this?" His voice sharpened. "A criminal?" "I didn't leave you for anyone." "Then why'd you leave?" "Because you scared me. Because you broke things when you drank. Because every apology sounded emptier than the last. Because loving you felt like surviving a storm every day." But Grace couldn't say those things aloud. "Not here. Not now." Trevor grabbed her arm. "Hard. You think you can ignore me?" The second his fingers tightened around her, a machine flatlined. Everyone turned. Luca's eyes were open. The room froze. Trevor released Grace automatically. Slowly, painfully, Luca Moretti lifted his head from the pillow. The movement alone radiated violence. Not loud violence. Predatory violence. His dark eyes locked directly onto Trevor's hand, still hovering near Grace's arm. The silence became unbearable. Trevor tried to laugh again, weaker this time. "Hey man, relax. She's my girl." "Big mistake." Luca stared at him without blinking. Then his deep, exhausted voice filled the room. "She doesn't look happy." Trevor's face hardened instantly. "Excuse me?" Vincent quietly closed the recovery room door. Click. The sound made Grace's pulse explode. Trevor finally seemed to realize something was wrong. He looked around nervously. At the guards. At Vincent. At Luca. Then back to Grace. "What is this?" Luca removed the oxygen mask slowly. Even injured, even pale from blood loss, he still looked terrifyingly in control. "Come here," he told Grace. Every nerve in her body tightened. It wasn't a request. Trevor stepped between them immediately. "She's not going anywhere." Luca's gaze shifted to him again. Calm. Emotionless. Which somehow felt worse than anger. "Move." Trevor swallowed. But pride is a dangerous thing in front of dangerous men. "No." The room became deathly still. Grace could actually hear rain hitting the hospital windows 3 floors below. Luca leaned back slightly against the pillows, studying Trevor like he was deciding whether he mattered enough to kill. Then his eyes returned to Grace. Softened. Only slightly. But enough for everyone to notice. "Did he hurt you?" Luca asked quietly. Grace opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Trevor laughed nervously again. "This is insane." Vincent looked almost sympathetic toward him now, which was somehow more terrifying. Luca never looked away from Grace. "Answer me." Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. Because for the first time in a very long time, someone sounded angry on her behalf. Grace couldn't answer. Not because she didn't know the truth. Because the truth suddenly felt dangerous. Trevor stood beside her, tense and defensive, while Luca watched from the hospital bed with the kind of stillness predators had before they attacked. The silence stretched too long. That alone was enough. Luca's eyes darkened. Vincent quietly exhaled beside the door, like a man watching a tragedy unfold in slow motion. Trevor noticed it too. "What?" he snapped. "Why's everyone looking at me like that?" No one answered. Grace finally found her voice. "Trevor, just go home. I'm not leaving." "You need to." "The hell I do." His hand grabbed her wrist again. Not violently this time, but possessively. And that was somehow worse. Luca looked down at Trevor's fingers touching her skin. Then he smiled. Grace's blood turned cold. Because it wasn't a normal smile. It was the kind of smile people made right before someone disappeared forever. "Interesting," Luca murmured. Trevor tried to stand taller. "Look, I don't know who you think you are, Trevor," Grace whispered urgently. He ignored her. "Big mistake. You rich psychopaths think you own everything." Trevor laughed nervously. "What, you gonna threaten me because a nurse stitched you up?" Luca tilted his head slightly. Then, very calmly, "Yes." The word hit the room like a gunshot. Trevor's face paled. Evan Grace froze. Luca slowly swung his legs off the hospital bed despite fresh stitches pulling beneath the bandages. The heart monitor protested immediately. Vincent moved forward. "Luca, I'm fine." He clearly wasn't. But somehow that made him scarier. Weak men lashed out when injured. Powerful men didn't need strength to terrify people. Luca stood slowly to his full height. Trevor immediately stepped backward without realizing it. Grace noticed. So did Luca. "You touched her," Luca said quietly. Trevor forced a laugh. "She's my ex." Luca's expression didn't change. That wasn't the question. The air felt suffocating now. Trevor looked toward Grace like he expected her to fix this. Like she always had before. "Grace," he snapped softly, "tell this psycho to calm down." But Grace couldn't stop staring at Luca. At the blood slowly spreading through the edge of his bandages because he'd gotten out of bed too soon. At the terrifying restraint in his eyes. At the fact that every armed guard outside the room looked ready to kill for him without hesitation. And somehow, the only thing Luca seemed focused on was whether Trevor had hurt her. Trevor's voice sharpened. "Grace." She looked at him. Really looked at him. At the man who punched walls beside her head during arguments. Who apologized with flowers after making her cry. Who borrowed money from her while mocking her paycheck. Who made her feel small every single day until she forgot she deserved better. And for the first time, Grace saw fear in him. Not for her. For himself. Luca stepped closer. One slow step. Trevor immediately backed into the counter behind him. "You should leave," Vincent advised quietly. Trevor looked around the room again, finally understanding the reality surrounding him. The guards. The silence. The absolute authority radiating from the man in front of him. "Who the hell are you people?" Trevor whispered. Luca ignored the question. Instead, he looked at Grace. "Does he still bother you?" Trevor scoffed quickly. "She's exaggerating whatever she told you." "She didn't tell me anything." "Then why do you care?" That question changed something. The room became still again. Luca studied Grace for several long seconds. She felt trapped beneath his gaze in a way that should have terrified her, but didn't. That was the dangerous part. Then Luca answered, "Because she saved my life." Trevor rolled his eyes instantly, desperate for confidence again. "So what? You gonna buy her flowers? Pay her bills?" Luca's gaze never left Grace. "I'll give her anything she wants." The room went silent. Grace's breath caught. Trevor barked out an ugly laugh. "You don't even know her." "No," Luca agreed softly, "but I know what exhausted kindness looks like." Grace felt something crack quietly inside her chest. No one had ever described her that way before. Exhausted kindness. Not weak. Not pathetic. Not poor. Trevor pointed toward Grace angrily. "You think she's special? She's a broke nurse from the South Side who can barely pay rent." Wrong thing to say. Very wrong. Every guard in the hallway visibly stiffened. Vincent closed his eyes briefly. And Luca. Luca became terrifyingly calm. "What apartment?" he asked softly. Grace immediately looked up. "Luca, what apartment does she live in?" Trevor swallowed hard now. "Why?" Luca took another step closer. Trevor looked small suddenly. "I asked," Luca said quietly, "because if she's struggling while men like you make her life harder." His eyes darkened. "Then I need to correct that." Grace's pulse pounded violently. This was insane. Absolutely insane. Yet Trevor looked genuinely frightened now. "She owes me money anyway," Trevor muttered defensively. Luca stopped moving. The silence that followed felt lethal. Then, "How much?" Trevor blinked. "What? How much does she owe you?" Grace's cheeks burned instantly. "I don't owe him anything." Trevor laughed bitterly. $600. Luca reached toward Vincent without looking away from Trevor. Vincent immediately handed him a black card. No hesitation. No questions. Luca held it out toward Grace. "Take it." Grace stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "I don't want your money." "Then use it to leave that apartment." "I said no." Luca's eyes narrowed slightly. Not angry. Interested. Like nobody refused him often. Trevor suddenly laughed again, trying to recover control. "See? Even she thinks you're crazy." Luca ignored him completely, still watching Grace. "Do you know," he said softly, "what most people ask me for when they realize who I am?" Grace shook her head carefully. "Money, power, protection." His gaze lowered briefly to her trembling hands. "You asked for none of them." Something dangerous flickered behind his eyes then. Not obsession. Not yet. Worse. Interest. And Grace suddenly had the terrifying feeling that saving Luca Moretti might become the biggest mistake of her life. Trevor left 10 minutes later. Not because he wanted to. Because Vincent walked him to the elevator with 4 armed men behind him, and when Trevor returned briefly to grab his jacket, his face had gone completely white. He wouldn't look at Grace anymore. Wouldn't look at Luca either. The moment the elevator doors closed behind him, the entire hospital floor exhaled in relief. Grace didn't, because now she was alone with Luca Moretti. And somehow that felt more dangerous. The recovery room had gone quiet except for the soft hum of machines and the rain still sliding down the windows overlooking the city. Luca sat on the edge of the hospital bed while a doctor rebandaged the stitches he'd nearly torn open. Blood stained the fresh gauze anyway. He didn't react to pain. Not once. Grace stood near the sink, washing Trevor's fingerprints off her wrist harder than necessary. "You'll bruise yourself," Luca said calmly. She froze. "I'm fine." "You're angry." Grace shut off the water harder than intended. "You threatened someone in my hospital. He grabbed you. That doesn't mean you get to. He hurt you before tonight." "Not a question." "A statement." Grace looked away immediately. Luca watched her quietly. Even wounded, he somehow controlled the room without effort. The nurses entering avoided eye contact with him completely. Doctors lowered their voices around him instinctively. Fear followed him naturally, like expensive cologne. "You should rest," Grace said finally. "So should you." She almost laughed at that. "I work 16-hour shifts." "Why?" Because normal people need money to survive. Luca studied her face carefully. You think I'm not normal? Grace looked directly at him then. At the scars disappearing beneath the collar of his shirt. At the guards outside his door. At the blood on the floor from men who probably killed for him without hesitation. No, she answered honestly. Something unreadable crossed his expression. Not offense. Almost amusement. The doctor finished wrapping his bandages quickly and escaped the room like he couldn't leave fast enough. Then it was just them again, dangerously quiet. Grace gathered medical supplies to avoid looking at Luca too long. Because every time she did, something inside her chest tightened in ways she didn't understand. You were scared of him, Luca said suddenly. Grace's hands paused. Trevor. She forced herself to keep organizing supplies. He drinks too much. That wasn't my question. He gets angry. Luca's jaw tightened slightly. Grace noticed immediately, which felt dangerous too. Did he hit you? No. The answer came too fast. Luca noticed. Of course he did. Grace. She hated the way her name sounded in his voice. Soft. Controlled. Protective. Like he'd already decided she belonged somewhere near him. No, she repeated quietly. Not exactly. The silence afterward felt heavier than shouting. Luca leaned back slightly against the bed, eyes fixed on her. He made you afraid. Grace laughed bitterly before she could stop herself. You say that like you don't. That surprised him. Good. You should be afraid of me, he admitted calmly. Most men would have denied it. That honesty unsettled her more. Then why am I not? Their eyes locked. Something shifted between them. Dangerous. Intimate. The kind of tension that made people ruin their lives. Luca's voice lowered. Maybe because I've never looked at you the way he did. Grace's heartbeat stumbled. Before she could answer, the recovery room door opened sharply. Vincent entered first. But he wasn't alone. 3 more men followed. One of them was bleeding heavily from the shoulder. Another looked furious. The atmosphere changed instantly. Business. Violent business. Problem? Luca asked calmly. The injured man hissed through pain. Warehouse on Pier 9 got hit. Grace watched Luca carefully. Nothing about his expression changed. No shock. Not fear. Just calculation. How many? 6 dead. The room temperature seemed to drop. Grace suddenly became aware of exactly where she was standing. Inside a room full of dangerous men discussing murder like stock prices. The furious man slammed photos onto the counter. Someone sold information. Luca picked up the photos slowly. Grace accidentally glanced down. Bodies. Blood. Men with guns. Her stomach turned instantly. Luca noticed. Without a word, he flipped the photos face down. Small gesture. Terrifyingly gentle. Vincent spoke carefully. We still don't know who leaked your route tonight. Grace felt her pulse stop. Route tonight. The shooting. This wasn't random. Someone had tried to kill him. Luca's eyes darkened slightly. They knew where I'd be. We're handling it. No, Luca said quietly. You're failing to handle it. Nobody argued. Nobody even breathed too loudly. The injured man finally noticed Grace standing nearby. His expression hardened instantly. Why is she still here? Bad question. Very bad question. Luca looked up slowly. And suddenly every dangerous man in the room became cautious. She stays, Luca said. The furious man frowned. Boss, she saved my life. That doesn't mean she should hear this. Luca's voice stayed calm. That wasn't a suggestion. Silence. Grace's chest tightened unexpectedly, because she realized something horrifying in that moment. Men like these obeyed Luca instantly, without debate, without hesitation. And for some reason, he was protecting her. The injured man glanced toward Grace again, distrust obvious in his face. Can she even be trusted? Grace felt humiliation rise again. There it was, the reminder that she didn't belong in rooms like this. Poor nurse. Cheap shoes. Wrong world. But before she could step away, Luca spoke. She's under my protection now. Everything stopped. Vincent went still. The guards outside exchanged glances. Even the injured man looked shocked. Grace stared at Luca. What does that mean? His dark eyes met hers calmly. It means nobody touches you. The words hit harder than they should have. Because Grace had spent most of her life unprotected, unkosen, unimportant. And now, one of the most dangerous men in the city was looking at her like her safety mattered more than anything else in the room. That should have terrified her. Instead, it made her feel something far more dangerous. Sayin. Grace barely slept. Not because of the storm outside. Not because armed men stood guard across the hospital floor all night. Because every time she closed her eyes, she heard Luca's voice again. She's under my protection now. The words followed her through the dark hospital corridors like a promise she never asked for. Or maybe a warning. At 4 a.m, Grace sat alone in the staff lounge, staring at cold coffee she couldn't afford to waste. Her hands still trembled slightly. Not from fear anymore. That was the problem. A television mounted in the corner played muted news coverage of a violent shooting near Pier 9. Police lights flashed across the screen, while reporters spoke dramatically beneath headlines. Grace couldn't stop reading. Organized crime connections suspected. She looked away immediately. This wasn't her world. It couldn't become her world. The lounge door opened. Grace tensed automatically. But it was only Mia, another nurse from the night shift. Only, strange how quickly her definition of danger had changed. Mia hesitated near the coffee machine before finally speaking. So, she whispered carefully. Are you dating him? Grace nearly choked on coffee. What? The Mafia guy. He has a name. That's not a no. Grace rubbed exhausted hands over her face. I met him 6 hours ago. Mia leaned closer anyway. 3 armed men stopped Dr. Carter from entering his room earlier. Grace blinked. What? They literally blocked the chief surgeon. Mia lowered her voice further. And when he threatened security, she swallowed nervously. One of them asked if he wanted to keep breathing. Grace closed her eyes briefly. Perfect. Absolutely perfect. This is bad, she muttered. Mia stared at her like she was insane. Bad? Grace, that man looked at you like people in romance movies right before cities explode. That isn't comforting. Did you see the cars outside? Yes. The guns? Yes. The way he almost killed your ex with one look? Grace stood abruptly. I need air. She escaped before Mia could say anything else. The hallway outside remained heavily guarded. 2 men in black suits straightened immediately when they saw her approaching. One pressed a hand to his earpiece. She's moving. Grace stopped walking. I'm sorry, what? The taller guard instantly opened Luca's recovery room door for her. Like she belonged there. That feeling unsettled her more every time. I was just walking, Grace said awkwardly. Yes, ma'am. Mom. Nobody had called her that before. Inside the room, Luca sat near the window wearing black dress pants and a partially buttoned shirt despite the fresh bandages wrapped around his ribs. Grace stared. You should not be standing. Luca glanced toward her calmly. Good morning. That's not an answer. You're worried about me. I'm a nurse. But not everyone looks at me the way you do. Grace hated how easily he said things like that. Like he could see through people instantly. Sunrise barely touched the skyline outside. Pale blue light spilling across the room. It softened Luca's features slightly. Not enough. He still looked dangerous sitting there barefoot with fresh stitches beneath expensive black fabric, while armed men guarded the hallway outside. How are you feeling? Grace asked professionally. Alive. She checked his bandages carefully, trying to ignore how close they suddenly were. Trying to ignore the heat radiating from his skin. Trying very hard not to remember how his body felt collapsing against hers earlier that night. You reopened part of the wound. You noticed. I have eyes. Luca watched her silently while she replaced the gauze. The tension between them felt heavier now. More personal. Dangerously personal. Why nursing? He asked suddenly. Grace focused on the bandages. Why organized crime? A faint smile touched his mouth. First real smile she'd seen from him. It changed his whole face. That was dangerous too. You first. Grace sighed softly. My mother got sick when I was 14. The room quieted instantly. She died 3 years later. Grace kept her voice steady through practice alone. The nurses were kinder to her than most of our family. Luca listened carefully. No interruptions. No fake sympathy. Just attention. So you became one of them. Grace nodded once. Someone should sit beside people when they're scared. Something flickered behind Luca's eyes at those words. Pain. Real pain. Gone almost instantly. But she saw it. Who sat beside you? He asked quietly. Grace looked down. No one. The silence afterward hurt more than it should have. Then Luca reached toward her. Slowly. Giving her time to move away. Grace didn't. His fingers brushed lightly against her wrist where Trevor had grabbed her the night before. The bruises were darker now. Luca's jaw tightened instantly. Grace. It's fine. No, he said softly. It isn't. Before she could answer, shouting exploded in the hallway outside. The door burst open violently. One of Luca's guards stumbled inside, bleeding from the mouth. Boss. Gunshots echoed down the corridor. Grace froze. Everything happened at once. Luca moved faster than someone with fresh stitches should have been capable of moving. He grabbed Grace instantly. Hard. Protective. The lights shattered above them. Glass exploded across the room. More gunshots. The guards outside returned fire immediately. Grace's heartbeat became pure chaos as Luca shoved her behind the hospital bed with his own body shielding hers completely. Stay down, he ordered. Another bullet tore through the window behind them. Grace gasped. This was real. Not movie violence. Not headlines. Real bullets. Real blood. Real death. Luca reached beneath the mattress and pulled out a handgun. Grace stared at him in shock. You hid a gun in a hospital bed? 2 guns. The calmness in his voice terrified her. Outside the room, men screamed. Gunfire thundered through the hallway. Luca checked the weapon quickly before looking at Vincent entering through the smoke-filled doorway. There are 8 shooters, Vincent snapped. South stairwell 2. Luca's expression turned ice cold. Get her out. Grace grabbed Luca's arm instantly. What about you? Wrong thing to say. Because every man in the room noticed it. Not the fear in her voice. The concern. Luca looked down at her hand, gripping his arm, then into her eyes. And despite bullets tearing apart the hospital around them, he suddenly looked calmer. Grace, he said quietly, listen carefully. Gunshots exploded again nearby. But Luca never looked away from her. If anything happens today, his thumb brushed once against her trembling hand. You run first. Then he released her and walked directly into the gunfire. Uka. Grace barely recognized her own voice over the gunfire. He disappeared into the smoke-filled hallway without hesitation, black handgun steady in his grip while chaos erupted around the hospital floor. Another burst of bullets shattered glass beside the door. Vincent grabbed Grace immediately. We have to move. No. Yes. The deadly calm in his voice left no room for argument. 2 guards surrounded them instantly while screams echoed from lower floors. Somewhere nearby, hospital alarms began blaring. Grace stumbled as Vincent pulled her toward the emergency stairwell. What's happening? She gasped. Someone's trying to finish what they started at Pier 9. Gunshots thundered again. Closer this time. Grace flinched automatically. One guard pushed open the stairwell door and immediately took a bullet through the throat. Blood sprayed across the concrete wall. Grace screamed. The guard collapsed at her feet. Everything became chaos again. Down! Vincent roared. Another shooter appeared below the staircase wearing black tactical gear and a mask. The rifle in his hands swung upward toward Grace. Vincent fired first. The sound exploded inside the narrow stairwell. The masked man fell backward down the stairs. Grace couldn't breathe. She'd never seen someone die before tonight. Now bodies kept falling around her like rain. Vincent grabbed her shoulders hard enough to force her attention back to him. Listen to me carefully, he said. They know about you. Fear stabbed through her chest. What? The shooters. Another burst of gunfire echoed somewhere below. Vincent's face darkened. They aren't only here for Luca anymore. Grace's blood turned ice cold. No. This wasn't possible. She was nobody. A broke nurse with overdue bills and thrift store shoes. Why would anyone target her? As if reading her thoughts, Vincent spoke quietly. Because Luca protected you publicly. The horrifying reality settled into place instantly. Protection had consequences. Luca claiming her had consequences. And now people wanted to hurt her because of it. One of the remaining guards pressed a hand to his earpiece suddenly. Boss is moving toward ICU wing. Heavy gunfire crackled through the speaker. Then, 3 rapid shots. Silence. Grace's stomach dropped. What was that? Nobody answered. Vincent's jaw tightened dangerously. We're leaving. Grace shook her head immediately. No, this isn't negotiable. I'm not abandoning patients. Even now, terrified beyond reason, the words came automatically. Nurse first. Always. Vincent stared at her for a second. Then something almost like respect crossed his face. You really don't understand what you've become to him yet. Grace opened her mouth. The stairwell door above them exploded inward. Another shooter. Masked. Armed. the rifle aimed directly at Grace. Everything slowed. Vincent moved. The guard moved. The shooter fired. And suddenly another body slammed into Grace from the side, knocking her violently against the concrete wall. Gunshots erupted point blank. The shooter collapsed instantly. Grace blinked in shock. Luca stood between her and the body, breathing hard. Blood dripped from his side. Fresh blood. Much too much of it. Luca. His dark eyes scanned her frantically. Not romantic. Not soft. Predatory panic. Are you hurt? Grace stared at him. The entire hospital was turning into a war zone, and his first question was whether she was hurt. I'm okay. Only then did he breathe again. Vincent looked furious. You left the east corridor exposed. They were heading for her. The answer came instantly. Like there'd never been another option. Another explosion shook the building. Dust fell from the ceiling. Luca grabbed Grace's hand without hesitation. Move. This time she didn't resist. They descended through smoke-filled hallways while armed guards surrounded them tightly. Emergency lights painted everything flashing red. Bodies littered parts of the corridor now. Grace tried not to look. Tried not to think about how casually Luca stepped over blood while holding her hand firmly against his chest. How many attackers? He asked Vincent. More than expected. Police? Delayed. Of course they were. Grace realized then how deep Luca's world truly went. Powerful enough to delay police during an active shooting. Terrifying. They turned another corner and found 3 masked gunmen waiting. Everything happened instantly. The guards opened fire. Grace screamed as bullets tore through the walls around them. Luca shoved her behind him again. Always behind him. Always protected. One attacker dropped. Then another. The third shooter fired wildly before collapsing beneath Vincent's bullet. Silence crashed down again. Grace's ears rang violently. Luca turned toward her immediately, hands gripping her face carefully despite blood staining his fingers. Look at me. She did. Barely. Too shaken to think properly. You stay with me, he ordered softly. Do you understand? Grace nodded automatically. Luca's thumb brushed beneath her eye suddenly. Only then did she realize she was crying. Something inside his expression changed when he saw the tears. Not weakness. Rage. Cold, terrifying rage. Vincent noticed too. Boss. Luca never looked away from Grace. They frightened her. The hallway became deathly still. Every guard around them understood exactly what that meant. Grace didn't. Not fully. But Vincent's face hardened, like a man anticipating violence beyond reason. Luca released Grace slowly before turning toward the guards. Find out who ordered this. His voice stayed calm. That made it worse. Then he added quietly, and make sure the city understands what happens when someone points a gun at what's mine. Grace's heartbeat stopped. What's mine? The words hit harder than the gunfire. Luca turned back toward her immediately afterward, expression softening again in a way that made no sense. Like the monster and the protector existed inside him at the same time. And somehow, only she seemed to see both. Grace didn't realize she was still holding Luca's hand until the gunfire stopped. The hospital hallway looked destroyed around them. Broken glass glittered across the floor. Emergency lights flashed red over bullet holes. Abandoned medical carts, blood-stained walls, and terrified staff crouched behind doorways. But Luca stood at the center of it all like the violence belonged to him. Like chaos recognized its owner. His fingers tightened once around hers. Don't look, he said quietly. Too late. Grace had already seen enough. A masked shooter lay near the nurse's station, weapon kicked away, blood spreading beneath him. Another was dragged down the corridor by Luca's men. He was alive, barely, and begging in a language Grace didn't understand. Vincent followed with a cold expression. No mercy. No hesitation. Grace's stomach twisted. She pulled her hand back from Luca's. He noticed immediately. Something sharp crossed his face before he hit it. You're afraid of me again. Grace looked at him, breathing unevenly. You just called me yours. The hallway seemed to go quieter. Even the guards nearby pretended not to hear. Luca's eyes didn't move from hers. Yes. The honesty made her chest ache. I'm not property. I know. Then don't say it like that. For the first time since she'd met him, Luca looked uncertain. Not weak. Never weak. But careful. As if Grace's opinion mattered more than the blood on his shirt, more than the men waiting for orders, more than the war he had just survived. He stepped closer slowly. I said it wrong. Grace blinked. She hadn't expected that. Men like Trevor never apologized unless they wanted something. Men like Luca didn't seem like they apologized at all. But his voice remained low and controlled. I meant, he said, that anyone who tries to hurt you answers to me. Grace swallowed hard. That still sounds dangerous. It is. Another honest answer. She hated how much she trusted it. Before she could respond, Dr. Carter appeared near the damaged nurse's station, face pale, lab coat stained with dust. This is insane, he snapped, voice shaking. This hospital is not your battlefield. Luca's expression cooled instantly. Grace saw the shift. The man speaking to her vanished. The boss returned. Dr. Carter pointed at Grace. And you, this is your fault. The words hit her harder than expected. Grace went still. Luca did too. Dr. Carter didn't notice the danger fast enough. The entire floor was attacked because you got involved with him, he continued. You bring trouble everywhere you go. First your ex, now this. Maybe if you knew your place. Luca moved. Not violently. Worse. Quietly. He stepped between Grace and Dr. Carter with the kind of calm that made armed men straighten behind him. Finish that sentence, Luca said. Dr. Carter's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Luca looked at him like he was already regretting leaving him alive. Then Grace touched Luca's arm. Softly. Don't. One word. Every guard watched. Vincent watched. Dr. Carter watched. And Luca stopped. Because she asked him to. The realization moved through the hallway like electricity. Grace felt it too. Her voice had power here. Not because she was rich. Not because she carried a gun. Because Luca listened. Slowly, Grace stepped around him and faced Dr. Carter herself. Her legs were still shaking. Her scrubs were ruined. Her hair was loose around her face. But something inside her had changed. Maybe it had started the moment Luca asked if Trevor hurt her. Maybe it had started when she realized every person who mocked her was suddenly afraid. Or maybe it had started years ago, buried beneath survival, waiting for one final insult to wake it up. My place? Grace repeated quietly. Dr. Carter swallowed. She stepped closer. My place was beside a dying patient when everyone else froze. No one spoke. My place was in that operating room when you misread the wound. Dr. Carter's face darkened. My place was protecting patients during a shooting, while you hid behind a locked office door. A nurse gasped softly behind them. Dr. Carter's jaw tightened. You don't know what you're saying. Grace looked him directly in the eye. For once, she didn't lower her gaze. I know exactly what I'm saying. The silence afterward was different. Not frightened. Awed. The same nurses who had laughed at her shoes now stared like they were seeing her for the first time. Luca stood behind her, still and unreadable. But Grace felt his attention, like heat against her back. Dr. Carter looked around, realizing he had lost the room. That made him angrier. You think this man makes you untouchable? Grace's voice stayed steady. No. She glanced briefly at Luca. Then back at Dr. Carter. I think I survived long before he walked through those doors. Something softened in Luca's eyes. For a moment, the whole destroyed hallway faded. There was only Grace standing beneath flickering emergency lights, blood on her sleeves, fear still in her body, but no longer ruling it. Vincent returned then, expression grim. We have the name. Luca turned slowly. Who? Vincent's gaze flicked briefly to Grace. That single glance made her pulse drop. Luca saw it. Say it. Vincent stepped closer, lowering his voice, but not enough to keep Grace from hearing. The attack was funded through a shell account linked to Trevor Hale. Grace's entire body went cold. No, she whispered. Luca became perfectly still. Too still. Vincent continued carefully. It may not mean he planned it, but money moved through him. Someone used him, or he sold access. Grace shook her head, trying to force the words away. Trevor was cruel, drunk, possessive. But this? People had died. Because of information tied to him. Because of her. Luca looked at Grace, and for the first time she saw no possession in his face. Only concern. You didn't cause this, he said immediately. She hated that he knew what she was thinking. I brought him here. No, he followed you. Grace's breathing turned shallow. The hallway tilted slightly. Luca reached for her, then stopped himself. Waiting. Letting her choose. That small restraint nearly broke her. Grace stepped toward him. Just one step. But it was enough. Luca wrapped an arm around her carefully, mindful of the blood on his side and the fear still trembling through her. His voice lowered near her ear. "I'll handle Trevor." Grace pulled back instantly. "No." His eyes darkened. "Grace, no killing him." The guards around them shifted slightly. Luca stared at her. "You still want to protect him?" "No," she said, voice shaking. "I want to protect myself from becoming someone who needs blood to feel safe." The words landed hard. Even Vincent looked away. Luca studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. "Then we do it your way." Grace searched his face, not trusting it. "What does that mean?" "It means he breathes." Luca's expression turned deadly calm, but he loses everything else. By sunrise, the city knew Grace Miller's name. Not because she wanted it to. Because Luca Moretti made sure the story spread exactly the way he wanted. Not poor nurse. Not charity case. Not hospital joke. The nurse who saved Luca Moretti. The nurse he protected. The nurse no one was allowed to touch. By afternoon, Dr. Carter was suspended pending investigation after multiple staff finally came forward about his negligence and abuse. By evening, Trevor Hale was arrested outside a cheap motel with blood on his shirt, stolen hospital access codes on his phone, and enough illegal payments in his account to destroy whatever life he thought he still controlled. Grace watched the news from Luca's penthouse window. She hadn't agreed to stay there permanently, only until the threat was gone. At least, that was what she told herself. The apartment overlooked the city like a throne room in the sky. Dark marble floors, rain-washed glass, low golden light, armed guards outside the private elevator. A world she didn't belong to. Yet when Luca entered quietly behind her, wearing a black shirt over fresh bandages, she didn't feel like an intruder. She felt seen. "You changed the headline," she said without turning. On the television, the reporter spoke over footage of the hospital convoy. "Hero nurse saves Mafia boss during night of bloodshed." Luca stood beside her. "They should know what you did. They'll also know I'm connected to you." His gaze moved to her reflection in the glass. "You are." Grace looked at him. "Not afraid this time. Careful. You don't get to decide that alone." Something almost like pride moved across his face. "No," he said softly, "I don't." The answer settled between them. Quiet. Dangerous. Different. Grace looked back out over the city. For years she had survived by becoming smaller, quieter, less noticeable. Tonight, black SUVs still guarded the street below. Men feared her name now because they feared his. But that wasn't the part that changed her. The part that changed her was this. When Luca Moretti offered her power, Grace finally understood she didn't need to borrow it. She already had her own. And when Luca's hand stopped near hers, waiting again, Grace looked down. Then slowly laced her fingers through his. Not because he owned her, because she chose to stay. The first morning without sirens felt unreal. Grace woke to pale sunlight spilling across Luca's penthouse windows, soft gold over the city that had almost swallowed her whole. For a few seconds she didn't move. She just listened. No gunfire. No shouting. No hospital alarms. Only the quiet hum of the city far below, and the slow rhythm of someone breathing in the chair beside her. Luca. He had fallen asleep there instead of in his own room. Still in black. Still wounded. Still impossible. One arm rested across his stomach near the bandages. Grace had changed herself. His face looked different in sleep. Younger somehow. Less like a man who could order a city to kneel, more like someone who had spent his whole life waiting for a quiet moment and never trusting it when it came. Grace sat up carefully. His eyes opened instantly. "Of course they did." "Did you sleep?" she asked softly. "A little." "That means no." His mouth curved faintly. "You sound like my nurse." "I am your nurse." His gaze warmed, but he didn't tease her. Not this morning. Too much had changed. On the coffee table, newspapers sat folded beside untouched coffee. Grace saw her own face on one of them, caught by hospital security cameras beneath red emergency lights. Hero nurse who saved Luca Moretti, breaks silence. She hadn't broken any silence. Luca's lawyers had made sure no reporter came near her. Still, the city had taken her name and turned it into a legend overnight. Grace touched the edge of the newspaper. "People are going to make up stories about me now. They already have." She looked at him. Luca's voice stayed quiet. "Some say you're fearless. Some say you planned the whole thing. Some say I burned half the city down because you smiled at me. Did I? No." A pause. Would it have worked? Luca looked at her for a long second. Yes. Grace should have laughed. Instead, her chest tightened. Because behind the danger, behind the power, behind every black SUV and armed guards standing between her and the world, there was something else now. A choice. Not his. Hers. She crossed the room and sat on the edge of the chair beside him. Luca didn't reach for her first. He never did anymore. Since the hospital, he always waited. Grace noticed that. She noticed everything. "You scare me," she admitted. His expression didn't change, but his eyes did. "I know, not the way Trevor did." Luca went very still. Grace looked down at her hands. The bruises on her wrist had begun to fade. "Trevor made me feel trapped," she whispered. "You make me feel like standing too close to a fire." Luca's voice lowered. "And do you want to step away?" Grace was quiet for a long time. Outside, morning traffic moved through wet streets. Somewhere below, one of Luca's guards opened a black car door. The world continued as if nothing had happened. But Grace knew better. Some nights split a life in two. Before. After. She looked at Luca. "No," she said. Something broke across his face so quickly she might have missed it if she hadn't been watching carefully. Relief. Not possession. Not victory. Relief. Grace reached for his hand, slowly this time. His fingers closed around hers with almost painful restraint. "I won't become your weakness," she said. His thumb brushed over her knuckles. "You were never my weakness." "Then what am I?" Luca looked toward the city, then back at her. "The first thing I wanted to protect without needing to own." Grace's eyes burned suddenly. She hated that. She hated how easily he found the places she kept hidden. But she didn't pull away. Later that day, Grace returned to Street Vincent's. Not as the poor nurse everyone mocked. Not as Luca Moretti's protected secret. As herself. The ER went silent when she walked in. The same front desk. The same fluorescent lights. The same polished floor where she had once stood soaked from the rain while people laughed at her shoes. Only now, no one laughed. Mia ran to hug her first. Then another nurse. Then another. Grace saw Dr. Carter's empty office through the glass wall. His nameplate had already been removed. For a moment she simply stood there, breathing through the weight of it all. Then a young patient cried from Trauma Bay 2. Grace turned immediately. Because power had not changed the part of her that mattered most. Someone was scared. Someone needed her. And Grace Miller still knew exactly where her place was. That evening, when her shift ended, she stepped outside into the hospital parking lot. A black SUV waited beneath the streetlights. Luca leaned against it, pale but standing, dressed in black with his coat open, and his eyes fixed only on her. Grace stopped a few feet away. "You know people are staring," she said. "They usually do. At me. Good." She rolled her eyes but smiled despite herself. Luca noticed. He always noticed. He opened the car door, but didn't guide her inside. Didn't command. Didn't claim. Just waited. Grace looked at the hospital behind her. Then at the city ahead. Then at the dangerous man who had entered her life, bleeding, and somehow made her remember she was worth protecting. Finally, she stepped toward him. Not rescued. Not owned. Chosen. And when the black SUV pulled away from Street Vincent's, Grace looked through the rain-streaked window at the parking lot where everyone had once mocked her. This time nobody laughed. This time, the whole city watched her leave.